마지막 세션을 준비해 주시겠습니다. 여러분, 5분의 석학에게 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 그럼 저는 박상인 교수님께 마이크를 넘기겠습니다. 교수님.
Hello, my name is Sang Pearl. I am the moderator of this session. This is the last session of the 경향포럼, and it is a very special session because four distinguished scholars are invited again to discuss 4 topics in Korean context. So we'll take questions from floor after the panel discussion. Let's begin with the remedies for inequality. We have already discussed different remedies for inequality, and I believe we all agree on the importance of equitable sharing. Professor van Parijs, you talked about basic income. Will you recommend the basic income policy regardless any initial condition of any country?
Yes, I'll do that with pleasure, starting by focusing on the beyond inequality, because inequality is usually understood as inequality of income or wealth between households. And I invite you, it's a bit of my job as a philosopher here in the team, to reflect on whether this is really in this sense that we need to consider inequality. Isn't it inequality of something else we should be focused on, and inequality between something else than households? Very briefly. Sometimes the left is contrasted with the right as people fighting against inequality versus people fighting in favor of freedom. I think this is fundamentally wrong, that it is wrong for progressives, for people on the left, to say we are for equality against freedom. No, people on the left must say freedom is our value, but it must be real freedom, not purely formal freedom, and of course real freedom for all. That's the title of one of my books that was published also in Korean a couple of years ago. And for me, this is really fundamental. What we need to distribute, if not in an equal way, in a fair way, because sometimes there can be sort of justifiable inequalities, as had been mentioned before, the inequalities in favor of the makers as opposed to the takers, and so there can be a fair divergence from strict equality, but it must be equality, or what we must striving for is equality of freedom, of real freedom. And so that is what leads you then quite naturally to the idea of an unconditional basic income, because people who are at the same time in favor of equality and in favor of freedom may still reject an unconditional basic income, and we'll hear more about that, but at least they must be interested in the idea. But a basic income which must be certainly in part distributed in kind, given in kind, and there has been repeated insistence on the importance of a healthcare, good quality healthcare package, good quality education, which must be an absolute part of it. Just very briefly on the second aspect, which I want to underline, between whom, and that I believe is of special relevance to Korea. I believe that justice and the inequality that concerns is inequality between individuals. And the whole of the feminist movement in particular has insisted on what happens within the household. And so if you again turn to the question of basic income versus other measures to reduce inequality, like a minimum wage or acting on social insurance, however you finance a basic income, VAT, income tax, whatever, and whatever its level, a basic income will always be a redistribution from men to women. And I insist on this dimension, especially as we are here, 5 males on the stage. And as I see also, I saw in the first rows earlier today, there was a big overproportion of men. Now this inequality between genders is very important. So, and as a result of the cumulative impact of women participating less in the labor market, women earning less per hour than men, and 3, women having less capital than men. However you fund the basic income, it is a redistribution towards women, not only of purchasing power, but also of bargaining power within the households and on the labor market. So I wanted to insist on these 2 aspects. This is a way of going beyond inequality as it is usually understood, in a way, I think, with which none of the panelists will disagree.
I sense the Professor Stiglitz.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree at all. And I just want to reiterate the importance of the other dimensions of inequality, like I mentioned inequality of access to justice, which has been a very important part of the inequalities in the United States. But there are 2 things I want to mention. The first is that one shouldn't think of this universal basic income as relieving governments of the responsibility of creating jobs for everybody who wants to work. Sometimes people think of UBI as an alternative to having the marketplace provide jobs. And it seems to me that governments have a responsibility, as Mr. Hartz pointed out. A government has a responsibility to make sure that there are jobs for everybody who wants to work. And the second thing is that I don't think it goes far enough, because there still are the inequalities in the marketplace that are unjust. That is to say, the market income has a large element of what Angus talked about as takers, I talked about as exploitation, rent seekers, and the government, again, has a responsibility to address these inequitable inequalities that distort the economy and are pervasive and are a major reason for the magnitude of the inequalities in our society.
I understand that Professor Stiglitz put more emphasis on market income inequality. Professor Deaton, you, in some sense, advocate that inequality itself is not a bad thing. Sometimes it is recommendable if it can draw some innovation, value making, right? So what is your thought on the governmental intervention in reducing the inequality? How? Sorry, under what condition and how the government have to intervene to reduce the inequality? Professor Stiglitz has emphasis on the market income inequality, right? So some others emphasize on the redistribution policy, including the basic income.
Yeah. Is this on? Yeah. Well, one of the things I like about the universal basic income that Philippe did not talk about very much except at the very end is compared with many of the welfare schemes that we see today and the categorization of the other ones you gave in the lecture. A UBI would actually raise wages, which is very, very important in my side of the world, where I see a lot of the distress in America as associated with keeping wages down. And it's no accident that what are widely agreed in the US on both the left and the right to be the most successful anti-poverty programs, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, for instance, are programs that reduce wages and a large amount of the benefits of those schemes go not to the workers, but actually to the employers. I mean, they go to McDonald's or they go to whoever is being subsidized by these things. Now, maybe that's the only way we can get it in a polity that is so dominated by corporations, that the only way you can give anything to ordinary people is by giving part of it to the corporations. But that's a very long way from being a just world. The other thing you only talked about a little, which was when I read your book, I thought about a lot, and I really changed my mind a lot of things, was, and you didn't quite talk about this, which was in praise of idleness. And that's so orthogonal to the way that many politicians certainly think about. And I can see why you might want to downplay it in Because if you look at the experiments that people are doing on basic income, what most of the people who are doing these experiments are trying to establish is exactly the opposite of what you're arguing is a good idea, which is that they don't discourage people from working. And yet, the freedom that I absolutely agree with you on comes from actually enabling people not to work. I mean, that's what the universal basic income is for. And in some ways, it has a tragic history because in the 60s in the US, where there were these experiments, which are not basic income experiments, they were negative income tax experiments, what killed them politically, even among their supporters, was the demonstration that they caused people to work less. So I mean, it's a very interesting set of ideas, and I'm delighted that we're all talking about it in a very serious way.
Okay, before Professor Parijs, you respond, let me ask Professor Hartz. You designed the Hartz reform, especially Hartz reform 4. If you have another chance to redesign the Hartz reform 4, will you consider universal income as a substitute for Hartz 4?
Nein, ich würde das Grundeinkommen nicht einführen. Ich glaube, Arbeit hat eine solche Bedeutung, so viel Sinnstiftung und so viel Selbsterfüllung, dass man Arbeit als etwas, einen besonderen Wert in der Gesellschaft haben sollte. Und die Ungleichheit hier zu beeinflussen, müssen wir in der Gegenwart versuchen. Die Ideen, die hier sehr schön entwickelt werden, sind langfristiger Natur. Aber wir müssten in der Gegenwart handeln. Wir haben eine Demokratie, wir haben einen Rechtsstaat und deshalb müssen wir sehen, was können wir den Schäbolds, den Reichen zumuten. Und ich glaube, da sie auch Patrioten sind, dass sie auch wollen, dass die Gesellschaft sich weiterentwickelt, wenn man ihnen eine Steuergesetzgebung macht, die projektgebunden ist, zum Beispiel für die Ausbildung, für die Gesundheit, und dass man die Steuern dann so definiert, dass diese umgewidmet werden, nicht für alles Mögliche, sondern für diese Projekte. Ich glaube, da käme man der Ungleichheit ein großes Stück näher.
Yeah, I wanted to react briefly in the sense that the plea for a basic income rests also on a crucial differentiation between different sorts of paid activities. And indeed for some, the thankless activities, the lousy jobs, the expectations and the hope is that they will cost more than now, and therefore there will be a pressure, if not to pay them more, then to improve their quality, or in some cases to automate that in various ways. But at the same time, I want people, or basic income advocates want people to be able to prize themselves into jobs. Providing these jobs provide training, and in particular, for example, it struck me with my children, and perhaps also with yours, that was also mentioned in the Korean context, that for many of our children, when they're finished studying, it will be very difficult for them to find a job in the direction of their studies without doing first an internship. And then there are a few privileged kids whose parents are prepared to give them a basic income for 6 months or 1 year or 2 years, so that finally they can do what really corresponds to their calling, what they like to do and will do well for the rest of their lives. But many other kids are prevented from doing that because they don't have the elementary livelihood that will enable them to prize themselves into an apprenticeship or into an internship. And that's, for me, the people who are best qualified to discriminate between what is a good job and what is a bad job are not bureaucrats or legislators, they are the people themselves, because nothing in the formal definition of a job can really tell you whether it will be a job that will be good for you or bad for you. On the praise of idleness, and that I find particularly striking also in the Korean context, I was amazed when I was told that there was now a dramatic reduction in the working time that is going to come into effect very soon in Korea, from 68 hours to 52 hours per week. And there is this beautiful quote from Bertrand Russell that says the idea that the poor, the less well-off, could enjoy leisure has always been shocking to the rich. And I think that is also, and it's not that basic income is not at all meant to create a society of idle people or a society divided between active people and idle people. No, it's there to empower people. And part of empowering them consists in enabling some people who work too much, who work themselves into the grave, enable them to reduce their working time or just to breathe at a certain point. And that is very important. And so the subtitle of our book is A Radical Proposal for a Free Society. I insisted on that in my conception of justice, I think, which is shared by the co-panelists, perhaps not by Peter, but at the same time, it's also a free society and a sane economy. And a sane economy related also to the mindfulness course we've been invited to before. A sane economy is one that doesn't make people ill and doesn't make our planet sick. And so, and basic income is, of course, not the only element. Both have, all of you have insisted on education and lifelong learning, absolutely fundamental, but basic income, in my view, is also a part of it. It's a bold idea, but we must dare to introduce it.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this point that also Angus mentioned, on this experiment that was done in the 1960s of a negative income tax, which is like a basic income. And one of the things that it allowed people to do is to search longer for a better job. So what people, when they got unemployed, they were able to find eventually, to stay unemployed and search and get eventually a job that was more suited for their abilities. But let me ask a question, which is, there's another approach that some societies have taken, which is a guaranteed income. In India, they have what is called the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which has guaranteed employment 100 days a year to all the rural people in India. It's a massive, and what's interesting, it's a poor country, and yet it's managed to provide that guarantee that more advanced countries haven't been able to provide. One of the consequences was they changed the bargaining power of workers vis-a-vis these other jobs, and it led to an increase in wages. So, you know, it was interesting. One of the complaints against the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme by the landlords was that wages were going up. And those of us who were concerned about inequality said, that's one of the achievements, it's working.
If I can quickly, I've had a long time discussion about that with my friend and former compatriot Jean-Drez, who was involved in the scheme. Of course, one, it had good effects in terms of reduction of poverty, but of course one of the limitations of it is that the jobs that are provided are not necessarily close to where people live, that it tended to be, there was a gender divide which was enormous in the extent to which men and women could take advantage of these schemes. And then there was, the hope was that there would be some useful filtering device that only the really needy would make use of it, but some of the really needy were unable to make use of it because of family constraints or because of distance constraints. So that, in a way, of course, the simplest way of making people less poor, less sort of catastrophically poor, is to give them the money straight away without imposing this intermediate condition, which doesn't, and I fully agree with that, the right to an income cannot be a substitute to a right to work, because work matters for many reasons, irrespective to an income. But we need to give this right to an income in a way that doesn't trap people in a situation of inactivity. And that was the argument from the beginning. On that experiment, let me just give you an anecdote which is revealing. I had a discussion about 15 years ago, so at Yale, with Jim Tobin, who, as you know, was one of the inspirers of the McGovern proposal and of the experiments. He said, There were two main outcomes of these experiments, in my view. I wasn't surprised by either, but I was disappointed by the political reaction. The two main outcomes were, one, that there was a reduction in the labor supply, mainly of women, not massive, but significant. And the other one was that in one of the experiments, there was an increase in the rate of divorce. And he said, these two things, for me, were positive. There were women who were overworking, who managed to make their life a bit more livable by avoiding the double shift. And there were women who were completely pissed off with their men. The only reason why they stayed together was their financial dependency. And I left them. What's bad about that in terms of justice? And yet, he said, this is what killed the idea in the American realm.
Okay, let's move on to the second topic. And Professor Deaton, you...
Well, just a very quick point, which is, let me re-emphasize something that Philippe actually said, which is that within the universal basic income, part of that must be a commitment to healthcare and a commitment to education. And if I think about it in the American context, or even the Indian context, and I've also talked to Jean at great length about this, it's an enormously heavy lift to do the fiscal reorganization that it would take to give people all these good things, these choices, this freedom, and so on, all of which I agree with. And in my priority, we're living in India and in the United States in a place where large numbers of people don't have any health care, and where the educational system for a very large number of our kids is just truly awful, and where it's impossible to spend the money to improve those things. And I would go there first. And if you want to label that the starting part of a universal basic income, I'm with you. But I would prioritize those two things before I prioritize the leisure or the construction of human capital and so on.
I agree.
Okay.